Occasionally, we get those anniversaries for different systems that make me realize just how old we're all getting. But when it's a system that I feel like isn't that old, getting its 10th anniversary, it certainly puts things into perspective, especially when we think about the Xbox One and what exactly it represents in Microsoft's history for gaming, the turn that they took at that presentation for E3 and everything that sort of followed since then, and them trying to catch up this entire way. Well, today what I wanted to do was take a look at an Xbox One that I actually have and making an upgrade that feels incredibly unnecessary, but I mean, that's like half of what we do on this channel when it comes to some of this tech stuff. So we're going to go over that, as well as really the launch of the Xbox One and how Microsoft was maybe a bit too early to the game. Guys, if you enjoy this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. You know, I tend to forget just how big the Xbox One VCR is. And I also tend to forget that, for some reason, at this time, Microsoft and Sony really wanted glossy plastic on their systems, which we got to figure out who is making these decisions in the boardroom, because we still get glossy plastic systems. Anyway, what we're going to do here with this Xbox One is we're going to put an SSD in it. Why, I'm not really sure, but I thought it would be interesting because way back when, it was a whole thing to replace the hard drive inside of the Xbox. You'd have to run a script and try to get the partitions just right and hope that the Xbox didn't double check the system or the hard drive and you could kind of sneak it past the security point. But now Microsoft has made it very easy to do. In fact, it's a drop-in replacement, and they themselves will provide the update for you to put on a USB stick, which means all we really have to do is tear this system down, remove the hard drive, drop the SSD in, put it together, and then just run the update and try out some games on it. Let's start getting it apart here, which just starts with the side panel coming off, and then we can slide this little piece of plastic out and then start unclipping the clips on the side and then around the back here. And while we're doing this, you know, I did want to think about what Microsoft did here in 2013, because this is such a massive turning point for the entire gaming industry. Really, up until 2013, Microsoft was right there with Sony. Sony stumbled out of the gate with the PS3, and it appeared that Microsoft was maybe set to overtake them with this generation. But then Don Mattrick came out on stage, described what the Xbox One was going to be, and then Sony took their opportunity and twisted the knife. And Microsoft's never really recovered from this. So what exactly was going on here? Well, we know they said TV 40-something times on stage, as they appeared to have a heavy focus on everything but games. And then on top of this, always online was apparently a requirement. There was used games restrictions being discussed. There were concerns around privacy, since there was a Kinect that at first was talked about being required. Then they backtrack on that, along with probably half of the stuff they discussed here. And it was more expensive, which is odd, because the Xbox One is technically weaker than the PlayStation 4. It also didn't help that Don Mattrick was busy trying to sell you an Xbox 360 if you didn't agree with a lot of the decisions they were making on stage. Now, I did mention that it was mostly just TV, and that is pretty much the meme around this, but if you look back on that presentation, they did show off a number of games, like Metal Gear Solid 5, Rise Son of Rome, Sunset Overdrive, Forza Motorsport 5, Dead Rising 3, Killer Instinct, Quantum Break. They even showed off the new Halo game, which went on to be Halo 5, I believe. So, well, at least it was a new game, I guess. And then to follow up that presentation, Sony showed up with a cheaper $400 PS4 that was more capable, and you could share your games. They had an entire video that was just them handing one game to another person, and that was sort of it. Microsoft was spiraling out of control ever since, and it's been a rough go after 2013 for Microsoft. They've managed to recover in terms of their revenue and really their software sales, but hardware now is still even trailing the Xbox One with their Xbox Series system. And Phil Spencer has mentioned in a podcast, in an interview, that was the worst generation to lose, because that's when people really started building their digital libraries. And yeah, that was really, if you think about it, the first time, the launch of the PS4 and the Xbox One, where day one out of the gate, you could just start buying every retail game digitally instead of physically. Anyway, back to the system. There are T9 screws all over the top of this system, so you just have to take them out, manage the wireless card at the top left there with the antenna running around, and then you also have to unplug the speaker for the system. So hey, if you're annoyed that your Xbox tends to make a beep whenever you turn it on, or the eject button, you can just unplug the speaker and you should be good. You can just eliminate any noises there it'll make. After you do remove the wireless card at the top, there is one other screw underneath, and then you can lift the entire metal cage up, and there is a plug you have to pull out of the board to lift the whole thing free. It is funny to look inside the Xbox One because there's just so much empty space in this system. Really, Microsoft must have looked at the 360 and had severe flashbacks to Red Rings and that sort of thing, because they went above and beyond in terms of just trying to keep the system from suffocating. Now, later on, they decided to bring it much closer together with things like the Xbox One S and even the Xbox One X, but to start out, they were not messing around with this one. They gave it plenty of room to breathe, and to be fair, the Xbox One was pretty good in terms of its thermals, its noise level with the fan, and a lot of that also stemmed from them revising the Xbox 360 over time with that 360 Slim and coming up with the idea of having the fan directly on top of the heatsink and blowing air at that time out of the side of the Xbox 360. The good news is the hard drive is right there. So we just unplug the SATA and the power, lift the entire thing up. There's 4 Torx screws on the bottom that's holding the hard drive in. Remove that, put the SSD in, screw that together, plug it in, and that's kind of it. Like, we're just good to go. Also, I'm surprised the hard drive that was in here, this is a 2014 unit. It's been 9 years. It was still working fine. So in that case, that's pretty good for, I think this was a Western Digital. So not bad. Now, if you want to upgrade to an SSD, to my understanding, a 500, a 1 terabyte, and a 2 terabyte will all work. So you can just replace the drive as you would like with whatever brand, as long as it's not some weird number like a 480 gig hard drive, as an example. Just keep it straightforward and stock for what you think would be in an Xbox, because that's what the update we're going to use, the official one. You do need to get the update from Microsoft's website. It's called OSU 1. It's just over 6 gigabytes, but when you put that on an NTSF USB stick, I had to plug it into the side port. The back ones didn't work for this. Plug it into the side port, and when you turn it on, it'll have like an offline updater in like the troubleshoot section. After you do that, it will just sit there, update off of the USB, and then push you through the initial startup options. And then you're right at the menu with an SSD installed in that old Xbox One VCR. So of course, from here, I decided to just start installing a bunch of games, and I wanted to go back to some of the launch lineup stuff. So I played things like Battlefield 4, which still looks okay. I mean, it does look kind of crunchy at times. There's a lot of aliasing all over the place, but the fact that this was a game that launched in 2013, so 10 years ago, I think it still looks fairly impressive for its time. Rise Son of Rome is probably one of the more impressive looking games, just all things considered. And really, when we were in this era of people arguing about 900p versus 1080p or 720p versus 900p, for like the Xbox One versus the VCR, Rise really stood out from the crowd as being one of the best looking games just across the board. And it still shows here, actually. In fact, I would say while the gameplay is pretty basic, visually speaking, it's still one to look at. And of course, I had to fire up Killer Instinct, which was there at the launch of the system and recently got a new anniversary update and still plays well on the Xbox One. And I did also check out Need for Speed Rivals. We had Need for Speed games constantly releasing, and I'll admit this is one that I just don't remember very much at all. But for the most part, it looked all right. It ran pretty well, too, on the Xbox One VCR. I feel like just Need for Speed has gone in a significantly better direction recently with things like Need for Speed Heat or Need for Speed Unbound. So I do hope they continue on that path and don't go back to like that era where they had loot boxes for parts. One thing I did notice, though, is the system itself isn't as slow as I was expecting. I don't know if that had to do with the SSD that I put in there. I guess that could have an effect on it. But just navigating the menu, not bad. And what's really funny is this system is now 10 years old. And when I turn it on, it doesn't look any different really than the Xbox Series system. So I kind of wonder if maybe in 5 years, let's say the dashboard here has received enough updates so it still looks similar to the Xbox Series, if it'll even feel like a retro system then, because if the speed is manageable and the look is the same, it's just going to feel like I'm turning on another Xbox Series if I wasn't necessarily looking at the system that had just powered on. Which also brings me back to the original promises that were being made during that E3 2013 show, and the question of, was Microsoft just really early to the party? I mean, think about a lot of the stuff they were discussing, the idea of used game restrictions, always online requirements. I mean, that does seem kind of where we're heading right now with this all digital future in mind. Used games will eliminate themselves. And in fact, if Microsoft had just kind of hung out for that generation and just stuck with things out of the gate and not created this really poor first impression, they would have just kind of fallen backwards into the idea of just having mostly digital purchases on their store as they are doing now. The used game restrictions and always online requirements also falls into the idea of subscription services taking over. And right now we see Microsoft making the push for Game Pass. We see Sony, they're going big time right now with PlayStation Plus having multiple tiers, and I mean the top one being fairly expensive for what we've been used to with them in the past, and even Nintendo eliminating their entire virtual console section in lieu of just signing up for a subscription service to play the latest Nintendo 64 or Super Nintendo Edition. You know, a feature I kind of wouldn't mind them bringing back, and it sounds funny to say now because back then people just kind of fell out of it, was the Snap feature, and having that work in conjunction with live TV then didn't seem like as big of a deal. However, now I think about playing a handheld game while I'm watching TV or a football game or something there. In fact, that's one of the core uses I see people mention for the PlayStation Portal. But back then, 2013, 2014, it was a feature. It came built in with your Xbox. And since your Xbox One has to connect to the internet on initial setup to quote unquote activate, you'll never have access to that old OS again that would have Snap enabled. So that's just a feature that's completely extinct at this point. I get that according to Xbox, this did free up resources for developers to use, and the Xbox One was technically behind the curve for the PS4 when it came to raw compute power, but it was genuinely useful looking back on it. And I wouldn't mind seeing it make a return somewhat as an optional thing for the Xbox Series, or who knows, maybe even Microsoft's next generation system down the line. And despite them backtracking on basically all of those promises, really the first impression absolutely crushed them. And when you also think about the mainstream and their view on things like privacy concerns, with a Kinect out of the box that was at one point required, even according to them, heading into launch, to be connected, and it being always online and in sleep mode, people were wondering if the camera could listen to you or look around and see what you're doing. You kind of get the idea as to why people might not want that set up in their living room, although we all walk around with phones that obviously listen to us. Don't take my word for it. Fired up a browser and see what ads you're being served. So who knows? Maybe Don Matrick was heading in the right direction the whole time. Maybe he was more of a visionary than people give him credit for. He just showed up way too early. I do wonder if that Xbox One show had happened maybe in 2023, so maybe like this past year at E3 or something, if it would have gotten the same backlash now that it did back in 2013. We'll never really know, but something to consider. And so ends our look back at the Xbox One and completion of a SSD install inside of the VCR Xbox. There's really not a lot of reasons to do this at all. In fact, there's not really many I can think of for even buying an Xbox One VCR model outside of, I guess, just nostalgia, if you're thinking back on that 2013 launch as maybe something you really enjoyed, because otherwise the Xbox One S, the Xbox One X, even the Xbox Series systems with the backwards compatibility will give you just better overall experiences, just like completely. But hey, let me know what you guys think about all of this down below with that moment in time for Microsoft, that history there with the Xbox One and Don Matrick standing up on stage, unveiling it, and then telling everyone, hey, if you don't like it, we got a system for you. It's the Xbox 360. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.